Please look at me. Please.
If the man whose life you saved walked past you 100 times and never knew your name, would you still hand him back the one thing that could unmask you, knowing it might cost you everything you have left? Rain had been falling over London since noon, and by the time the carriages began lining up outside Wembrook House, the cobblestones shone like wet coal under the lanterns. Inside, candlelight poured gold across a ballroom filled with silk, laughter, and the particular hunger of people who had never once gone without a meal. Marianne Aldridge stood at the edge of it all in a borrowed blue gown, gripping a small velvet pouch so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She was not supposed to be here. She had told herself that 3 times on the walk over, and she told herself again now, watching footmen glide past with silver trays they would never let her touch. She had come to give back a ring. Nothing more. A duke's signet, heavy with diamonds and an old family crest, had turned up wedged inside the spine of a leather ledger she'd been rebinding for the municipal archive, and honesty had marched her straight to his door before good sense could stop her. She had not expected the door to open onto an entire world. She had not expected, either, that the moment she finally stepped close enough to place the ring in his palm, the Duke of Wembrook would go still as stone, staring at her like a man who had seen a ghost climb out of a grave he'd dug with his own hands. "It's you," he said, so quietly that the string quartet nearly swallowed it whole. "You're the one who pulled me out of the river." Somewhere behind her, a woman in wine-red silk had gone rigid, her smile freezing halfway to something crueler. Marianne did not yet know her name. She would learn it soon enough, along with a great many things she had never wanted to know: that the ring had never been lost by accident, that her own family name had once belonged to a title stolen out from under her, and that the Duke standing in front of her had spent a year turning the kingdom over stone by stone, searching for a woman he'd known for only 4 minutes in the freezing dark beneath a bridge. If you want to know how a bookbinder's daughter and a duke who never smiled found their way back to each other through lies, stolen land, and one very determined rival, stay with me. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello and hear how far along our story has traveled with you. The municipal archive on Faro Street smelled the way it always did in autumn: old paper, tallow smoke, and the faint sourness of glue left too long in its pot. Marianne Aldridge had spent 6 years inside those walls, first as a girl sent to sweep the floors, and now, at 22, as the only person Mr. Pemberton trusted to rebind the estate ledgers without cracking their spines. It was careful work, patient work, the kind of work nobody praised until it was done badly, and the kind that had taught her, more than any governess ever could, how to sit still with her own thoughts for hours at a time. She liked the quiet of it, mostly. The archive was one of the few rooms left in London where nobody looked at her boots before they looked at her face. Out on the street, people made their judgments quickly. The frayed hem, the mended glove, the particular way poverty taught a person to walk with their shoulders drawn in, as if apologizing for the space they took up. Inside these walls, surrounded by other people's old debts and older secrets, she was simply a pair of steady hands and a careful eye, and that had always been enough. She was 3 pages from finishing a ledger belonging to the late Baron Aldridge's neighboring estate, a stack of records so old the ink had gone the color of weak tea when her needle caught on something hard tucked behind the last signature page. She worked it loose with the flat edge of her bone folder, expecting a coin, or a pressed flower, or one of the small useless things people forgot inside old books. Once she had found a lock of hair tied with faded ribbon, and had spent a week wondering whose grief it belonged to. This was no lock of hair. It was a ring, heavy and cold, far too fine for the room it had landed in, a wide silver band set with a cluster of diamonds around a crest she didn't recognize at first glance, a hawk gripping a sprig of oak leaves. When she turned it toward the window, the stones threw small fires across the ceiling, and for a moment she simply sat and watched the light move, forgetting entirely to breathe. "That's not yours to keep staring at," said Nell Bridges, dropping into the chair across from her with an armful of unbound pamphlets. Nell had been Marianne's friend since they were both small enough to hide from the same landlord under the same market stall, and she had a gift for saying the true thing before anyone else dared to. "I know whose it might be," Marianne said slowly, still turning the ring in the light. "I've seen that crest on the corner of every notice about the Duke of Wembrook's shipping contracts. My father used to point it out to me when I was small on the sides of the grain carts. He said a man who put his own crest on his cargo either trusted his name completely or was daring anyone to doubt it. Then you know it's worth more than this entire building. Nell's eyes had gone wide and calculating in the way that always made Marianne nervous. The way they'd gone wide over a dropped coin purse when they were girls, or a baker's unwatched tray. Nobody would ever know, Marianne. Nobody in the world knows this ring exists outside of whoever lost it. You could sell 3 stones and keep the band, and live on it a full year without ever touching your wages. Your roof leaks. Your boots have more air in them than leather. When did you last eat something that wasn't bread and butter? It would have been so simple to agree. Her rent to Mrs. Pruitt was already a week late, and the coal bin had been empty since Tuesday, and the cold that crept up through the floorboards at night had begun to feel like a permanent tenant in her small room. She turned the ring over once more, feeling the old, stubborn thing in her that had never once let her keep what wasn't hers, not as a child sneaking bread from a stall 2 streets over, not as a girl finding a coin purse in the gutter outside a tavern, and not now, holding enough silver and diamond to change the shape of her whole year. "I'll return it," she said finally. "Whoever left it in this ledger will be looking for it, and I know what it feels like to lose something and have no one look. I'd want someone to look for me too, if I lost something that mattered." "You're not talking about a ring anymore." Nell said it quietly, without her usual teasing, and for a moment the two of them simply sat together in the smell of old paper and cooling tallow, each thinking of the same absence neither of them ever spoke of directly. Marianne's father, gone 8 years now, and the estate that had vanished with him into paperwork neither of them had ever understood. "Perhaps I'm not," Marianne admitted, "but I still mean to return it." Nell sighed the sigh of someone who had lost this argument 100 times before and would lose it 100 times again, and did not raise the subject a second time. Marianne wrapped the ring in a scrap of linen and tucked it into the inside pocket of her cloak, where it sat like a small, warm stone all the way home through streets going blue with dusk. She did not know yet how right Nell had been to worry, nor how far a single act of honesty could travel once it left her hands. 3 miles west, behind the iron gates of Wembrook House, Duke Alaric Thorne stood at his study window watching rain streak the glass and thinking, as he did most evenings, about 4 minutes he could not fully remember. A year ago his carriage had gone off the Keswick Bridge in a storm, thrown clean into the river by a startled team of horses, and the accounts of that night that had reached him afterward from the coachman who survived, from the villagers who'd come running with lanterns, never quite matched the fragments he carried himself. He remembered cold water closing over his head with a violence that had nothing gentle in it at all. He remembered his own coat dragging him down like a hand at his ankle, heavier with every stroke he tried to make toward air. And he remembered, more clearly than anything else in his life, a stranger's grip closing around his wrist and hauling him toward the bank with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere far larger than her frame, a woman's voice, low and steady even as the current tried to take them both, telling him to breathe, to hold on, that she would not let go. By the time the world stopped spinning enough for him to see her face properly, she was already gone, vanished into the dark and the rain as though she had never existed at all, leaving him coughing up river water on the bank with nothing to prove she had ever been real except the fact that he was, undeniably, still breathing. He had spent the past year proving that she had existed anyway. "You cannot keep a household in mourning for a woman you met once, Your Grace," said Mr. Abernathy, his steward, setting down a stack of correspondence with the particular patience of a man who had said this before and expected to say it again. He was older than Alaric by some 20 years, and had served the Thorne family long enough to speak more plainly than most men in his position dared. "Lord Wickham's daughter is downstairs, waiting for your answer regarding the shipping alliance. Lady Cordelia Vance is a sensible match, and I do not say that lightly. Her father's fleet would double your trade routes within a year, and the alliance would put an end to 3 separate disputes currently costing this house more than I care to total on a single page. I am aware of the arithmetic, Abernathy. You remind me of it weekly. Then perhaps your Grace might consider that arithmetic is rather easier to live with than searching every county register in England for a woman who may not wish to be found." Alaric did not answer that directly. He had grown very good, this past year, at not answering the things that cut closest, turning conversations instead toward smaller, Safer matters the harvest tallies. A dispute over a tenant's fence line. Anything with an answer that didn't require him to examine why a stranger's 4 minutes had outlasted a lifetime of carefully arranged comforts. He crossed to his desk and lifted a folded newspaper. The advertisement he'd had placed in 3 counties still visible along the fold, a reward offered for information regarding a woman present at the Kestwick Bridge accident of the previous winter, an advertisement that had produced, in 12 months, nothing but 3 false claimants eager for the reward and 1 enterprising thief who had tried to sell him a ring he'd never lost in the first place. Perhaps, Abernathy tried again, gentler now, setting a hand briefly on the back of a chair as though steadying himself for a conversation he'd had many times in his own head before daring to say it aloud. She does not wish to be found, Your Grace. Perhaps she wants nothing from you at all, and that is precisely why she never came forward when your notices ran in every paper from here to Kent. Then I would still like to thank her, Alaric said, and something in his voice closed the subject more firmly than any argument could have. A man ought to be allowed to thank the person who refused to let him drown. That seems a very small thing to want, Abernathy, after everything else I am expected to want on schedule. Downstairs, Lady Cordelia Vance waited in the drawing-room with the composure of a woman who had never once doubted she would eventually get what she wanted. Arranging herself near the window where the afternoon light fell most flatteringly and studying, with real and considerable intelligence, the ledgers of shipping routes her father had sent along with his proposal. She was clever and beautiful and entirely capable of running an estate the size of a small country, qualities Alaric respected without ever once feeling the pull toward her that everyone around him assumed he must feel, given how neatly the arithmetic worked out. When he finally joined her, she rose smoothly and pressed a folded letter into his hands, her father's proposal regarding the alliance, and smiled the smile of someone laying the first stone of a bridge she fully intended to walk him across, 1 patient conversation at a time. You look tired, Alaric, she observed, studying him with the same clear-eyed assessment she gave her father's trade routes. Still chasing your ghost? Still honoring a debt, he corrected, and did not elaborate further, though he noticed, not for the first time, how little that answer seemed to trouble her. Cordelia was not cruel. She simply did not believe, as a matter of practical fact, that a debt to a stranger could outweigh an alliance between 2 great houses, and nothing in her life had yet given her reason to think otherwise. It took Marianne 4 days to work up the nerve to carry the ring to Wembrook House herself rather than trust it to the post. For days in which she rehearsed a dozen different explanations while binding other people's ledgers, none of them sounding quite honest enough when she said them aloud to Nell in the empty archive after closing. When she finally stood before the estate's iron gates on a gray Thursday morning, cloak drawn tight against a wind that smelled of coming rain, she understood immediately why so few people like her ever crossed them. The gatekeeper, a broad man named Godfrey with a face permanently arranged into suspicion, looked her up and down twice before he spoke, his gaze cataloguing the mended hem of her cloak and the worn leather of her boots with the swift, dismissive efficiency of a man who had turned away 100 women just like her. Deliveries go round the servants' entrance, round the side there. I'm not making a delivery. She made herself stand a little straighter, the way her mother had once taught her to stand when facing a creditor. I need to return something to the Duke personally. Something of considerable value that belongs to this house. Everybody's got something for the Duke personally. He didn't move an inch, arms crossed over a chest built for exactly this purpose. Tradesmen's debts, love letters, begging petitions, women claiming to be long-lost cousins of some dead earl. His Grace doesn't receive strangers off the road. Miss, whatever you've got tucked in that cloak of yours. She had rehearsed a dozen ways to explain herself on the walk over, and every one of them died in her throat under his flat, unmoved stare. She might have turned back entirely, might have resolved to try the post after all and simply pray it arrived safely, if a housemaid hadn't come hurrying through the gate just then, arms full of laundry, nearly colliding with her in her haste. You'll want Mr. Abernathy, not Godfrey here, the girl said kindly, catching her breath and jerking her head toward the drive beyond the gate. He handles anything unusual that comes to the house. Come on. I'll walk you as far as the courtyard before Godfrey remembers. He's meant to stop you at the gate and not past it. Marianne followed her through before the guard could object. her heart hammering as the drive opened onto grounds larger than every street she'd ever lived on, combined clipped hedges stretching in disciplined rows, a fountain gone quiet and still for winter, and beyond it, the pale stone face of Wembrook House rising 3 stories into the gray sky, its windows catching what little light the morning offered. She had grown up hearing about places like this the way children hear about castles and stories, distant and unreal, the kind of setting that belonged to other people's lives entirely. Standing inside the gates of one now, ring resting like a small stone of guilt and purpose against her ribs, she felt entirely out of her depth and entirely certain she could not leave without finishing what she'd come to do. The maid, who introduced herself as Susan on the walk up the drive, left her waiting near a side entrance while she went to find Mr. Abernathy, promising it wouldn't be long, that he was a reasonable man who'd know what to do with whatever she was carrying. It was there, alone in the shadow of an ivy-covered wall with the wind picking at the edges of her cloak, that Marianne first heard voices drifting from an open window somewhere above her, a man's voice, low and unhurried, answering a woman's laugh with something that might have been amusement or might have been simple patience. She told herself it was none of her concern. She told herself that twice more, standing very still with her hands folded in front of her the way a proper visitor waited, before curiosity, always her worst habit, the one her mother had despaired of correcting, walked her 3 careful steps closer to listen, drawn by nothing more sensible than the simple human wish to know what a life like that sounded like from the inside. The window belonged to a private sitting room on the ground floor, its door left carelessly open onto a corridor Marianne had no business standing in, propped by a careless housemaid airing the room after some earlier fire had smoked. She only meant to look for a moment, to satisfy the small itch of wondering what a duke's private rooms might hold. The same idle curiosity that had once made her press her face to a confectioner's window to watch cakes being iced she would never taste. Instead, she found herself standing utterly still, watching a scene that seemed lifted from a painting she had no right to be inside. Duke Alaric Thorne sat on the edge of a low velvet settee, dressed in a dark blue coat that fit him the way good tailoring fits only men who have never once known want. His sleeves pushed back as he examined a thin, ugly cut across the palm of Lady Cordelia Vance's hand. She had caught it, apparently, on a broken hinge in the conservatory that morning, and was making rather more of the injury than the small wound seemed to warrant. Her fingers curled prettily around his while he dabbed at it with a cloth soaked in something that smelled faintly of witch hazel. "You'll live," he said, with the dry patience of a man who had already guessed she'd caught it on purpose, or at the very least was making the most of an accident. "You're terribly unromantic for a duke," Lady Cordelia said, and laughed the bright, practiced laugh of a woman certain she was charming, tilting her head so the candlelight caught the fine gold combs in her hair. Marianne knew she should step back. She knew it the way she knew rain was wet and fire was hot, as an obvious, undeniable fact her body simply refused to obey in that moment. There was something about the picture in front of her that held her still. The careful, unthinking way the Duke's hands moved, gentle even toward a woman he plainly did not love, competent in the manner of someone who had tended small hurts before without ever being taught the proper words for tenderness. It put a strange, unfamiliar ache in her to watch a stranger be fussed over so kindly, when she herself could not remember the last time anyone had tended a small hurt of hers without first calculating what it might cost them. Her elbow found the edge of a side table before her mind caught up with her body, and a little silver bell, meant to summon servants, toppled and rang once against the floorboards, sharp and clear in the quiet corridor, echoing far louder than its size had any right to. Inside the room, the Duke went still. "Someone's there," he said, already rising, setting down the cloth with a swiftness that surprised even Lady Cordelia, and Marianne's whole plan, the careful, honest, uncomplicated plan of simply handing over a ring and walking away with a clear conscience, dissolved instantly into the plain, animal instinct to run before she was discovered somewhere she had no right to. She did not run fast enough. Alaric crossed the sitting room in 4 strides and reached the corridor just as Marianne turned to flee toward the side door, catching only the edge of her a slate-blue cloak whipping around her ankles, a fall of dark hair coming loose from its pins in her haste, and a voice, sharp with panic, saying, "Forgive me, your grace. I didn't mean to intrude, I only—" He had heard that voice before. Not the words, the shape of it, the particular low, steady register of someone telling him to hold on, that she would not let go, while cold water dragged at both of them in the dark beneath Kestwick Bridge a year ago. It moved through him like a struck bell, sudden and complete, and every careful, reasonable habit he'd built over 12 months of pretending to move on abandoned him at once. "Wait," he said, and something in his own voice must have carried more than he intended, because Marianne froze with her hand already on the door, some instinct older than good sense telling her to stop. "Your Grace, I only came to return." She turned enough for him to see her eyes properly, hazel and startled and achingly familiar in a way he could not yet explain even to himself, before Lady Cordelia's voice cut through the corridor behind him, imperious and searching for an explanation for the sudden strange energy in the room. "Alaric? Who is that girl? And why does she know your voice well enough to run from it?" The interruption broke whatever fragile thread had stretched taut between them in that half-second of recognition. Marianne bolted through the side door into the rain-heavy dusk before he could cross the last few feet separating them, her heart hammering so violently she could barely feel her own feet on the gravel, leaving behind nothing but a ring, set down in her fright on the edge of the table just inside the door, the very ring she had walked 4 miles to return, now abandoned along with every careful explanation she'd meant to give. Alaric stood in the empty corridor holding a small, heavy circle of silver and diamond, his own family crest staring back up at him from a ring he had genuinely believed lost, and felt something in his chest he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long year. Hope, sharp and unreasonable and entirely too large for the moment, spreading through him faster than he could rein it in. "Find out who that was," he told Abernathy that same night, the ring resting on his desk like a compass suddenly pointing true north after a year of spinning uselessly. "Quietly. I don't care how long it takes or what it costs. I only ask that whoever searches does so with more patience than my newspaper notices ever managed." The trouble with quiet searches is that they rarely stay quiet for long, and within a fortnight, 2 different kinds of men had begun asking after a woman who worked at the Faro Street archive, each pursuing their questions with a purpose the other knew nothing about. The first kind worked for Mr. Abernathy, discreet and well paid, following the thinnest possible thread a housemaid's description of a slate-blue cloak, a bell that had rung at an inconvenient hour, a fall of dark hair glimpsed only for a moment toward the modest lending libraries and record offices scattered across the city, asking careful questions of clerks and shopkeepers without ever revealing whose interests they served. The second kind worked for Lord Rutherford Graves, and they were neither discreet nor kind, moving with the blunt confidence of men who had never once been made to answer for their methods. Marianne noticed the same broad-shouldered man loitering outside the archive 3 days running before she understood she was being watched rather than simply unlucky in her choice of streets to walk home along. She said nothing to Mr. Pemberton, who would have fussed and perhaps insisted on walking her home himself, a kindness she didn't have the patience to manage on top of everything else pressing on her mind. She said nothing to Nell either, at first, though Nell noticed the way she startled at every closing door and the way her hands had begun to shake slightly over the finer bindings. "Something's wrong with you, and it isn't only the ring," Nell said flatly one evening, when Marianne finally admitted to the watching man. "Why would anyone trouble themselves to follow an archivist over a piece of jewelry you no longer even have?" Marianne didn't have an answer, not yet, though the shape of one had begun to form in the back of her mind, unwelcome and persistent half-buried memories of her father, the late Baron Aldridge, and the strange, sudden ruin that had swallowed his estate when she was still a girl too young to understand debts or deeds or the difference between the two. She remembered men in fine coats coming to the house with papers her father signed with shaking hands, his face gray in a way she hadn't understood at the time. She remembered the word forged, whispered once by her mother in the dark and never explained afterward, no matter how many times young Marianne had asked. She had grown up believing her family had simply lost everything to bad luck and worse management. The story her mother had settled on and repeated until it hardened into something like truth. It had never once occurred to her that someone might have taken it on purpose, and that the taking might still matter, years later, to men with money enough to hire watchers over a returned ring. What she did not yet know, and would not learn for some weeks still, was that Lord Graves had been the one to slip the Wembrook signet into that particular ledger in the first place, not lost by careless accident at all, but planted deliberately among records he believed would be quietly burned rather than carefully rebound by a conscientious archivist, hoping that whoever eventually found it would be caught trying to sell a duke's ring and hanged for theft, a manufactured scandal he could then lay at the Duke of Wembrook's door for keeping such careless company among his household's old papers. He had not planned on honesty walking straight into the middle of his scheme. He had certainly not planned on a woman like Marianne Aldridge, who returned things simply because they weren't hers to keep. If you're starting to root for her the way I did while first hearing this story, stay close, subscribe to see how it unfolds, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I do love hearing how far along the story has traveled to reach you. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a boy in unfamiliar livery, who would not say who had sent him and vanished down the street before Marianne could ask a second question. Thick cream paper, gold lettering pressed so deep she could feel the letters beneath her fingers. An invitation to the Duke of Wembrook's midwinter masquerade addressed, unmistakably and impossibly, to Miss M. Aldridge. "Somebody knows your name," Nell said, turning the card over as though an explanation might be written on the back in smaller print. "Somebody at that house knows your name and wants you in that ballroom, Marianne, and I don't like that we don't know which somebody it is." Marianne thought of the Duke's voice in the corridor, the single word that had frozen her hand on the door. Wait, she thought of the ring still sitting, presumably, wherever she'd left it in her fright, and the plain fact that she had failed, after everything, to actually finish what she'd set out to do that day. Perhaps that was reason enough to go. Perhaps it was only the excuse she wanted to believe, dressed up as duty because duty was easier to admit to than curiosity, or hope, or the small persistent memory of a man's steady hands tending a stranger's hurt with more gentleness than the moment required. "I have nothing to wear to a masquerade," she said, which was true, and also the smaller of her two fears by a considerable margin. Nell solved the first problem within a week, borrowing a gown of pale blue lace from a seamstress she knew, who owed her a favor from an old debt neither of them spoke of aloud, and fashioning a simple domino mask from scraps of ribbon and cream lace left over from a dressmaker's discarded pattern. She could not solve the second fear at all, because Marianne never spoke it aloud even to her, the quiet, persistent worry that whatever waited for her inside that ballroom, invited by an unknown hand for reasons she couldn't guess, might not be kindness at all, but something closer to a trap dressed up in gold lettering. "You don't have to go," Nell said finally, watching her friend's reflection in the small cracked mirror they shared. "Nobody would think less of you for staying home and letting the whole strange business drop." "I know." Marianne straightened the mask, studying the stranger it made of her in the glass. Someone bolder and more mysterious than the woman who spent her days bent over other people's ledgers. "But I think I've spent my whole life being careful, and it hasn't once made me safe. Only small. I would rather walk into that ballroom and be wrong about it than spend the rest of my life wondering." She went, and did not look back at her own street as the hired carriage paid for with money she genuinely could not spare carried her west toward Wembrook House through streets already thick with fog. Wembrook House at midwinter blazed with more candlelight than Marianne had ever seen gathered in one place, gold and glittering against 100 masks that turned strangers into a sea of near-identical silk and secrets, laughter rising and falling with the music in waves that made the whole room feel like something breathing. She kept to the edges at first, watching the dancing with the wary fascination of someone certain she'd wandered onto a stage where she didn't know her lines, counting exits the way her mother had once taught her to count them in unfamiliar rooms, out of habits neither of them had ever explained. She saw him before he saw her, Duke Alaric Thorne, unmasked by rank as dukes always were even at their own masquerades, standing near the musicians with the stillness of a man enduring rather than enjoying his own party, his eyes moving restlessly over the crowd as though searching for someone he couldn't quite name even to himself. Beside him, in wine-red silk that Marianne recognized instantly from the corridor a month before, stood Lady Cordelia Vance, her hand resting on his arm with the easy possession of someone who had already decided the outcome of the evening and was simply waiting for the rest of the room to catch up to her certainty. It was Cordelia who found her first, drifting through the crowd with the unhurried grace of a woman who never needed to hurry toward anything. "The archive girl," she said, low enough not to carry beyond the two of them, her smile sharpening into something Marianne hadn't seen in the sitting room a month before. "How resourceful of you, to receive an invitation to a house you have no earthly business entering." "I was invited," Marianne said steadily, which was true, though she had begun to suspect, standing here now under Cordelia's assessing gaze, that the invitation had not come from any friend of hers at all. "Were you?" Cordelia's gaze slid past her toward a nearby alcove, exchanging a brief, meaningful glance with a tall, Thin-faced man Marianne didn't recognize Lord Rutherford Graves, though she wouldn't learn his name until later that same night. How fortunate, then, that Lord Graves happened to notice a piece of my family's jewelry missing from this very room not 10 minutes ago, and mentioned seeing an unfamiliar woman lingering rather too close to the display case beforehand. Marianne felt the trap close before she fully understood its shape. The way a person feels a storm coming before the first drop of rain touches their skin, a tightening in the air. A sudden watchfulness spreading outward from Cordelia's raised voice as nearby heads began, one by one, to turn toward them. They lured her upstairs under the pretense of privacy, away from the ballroom's watching eyes and toward a quieter accusation that would draw less immediate scandal. And it was there, in a hall lined with portraits of Thorne ancestors who had never once had to justify their presence anywhere in their lives, that Lady Cordelia let the pretense finally drop entirely. "You will return what you stole," Cordelia said, her voice gone hard beneath its polish. "Or you will be dragged from this house in front of everyone who matters in London, and no one, not one soul in that ballroom, will believe an archive girl over a viscount and an earl's daughter, whatever pretty invitation found its way into your hands. I haven't stolen anything." Marianne's voice shook despite everything she did to steady it, her hands curling into the fabric of her borrowed gown. "I came to this house once, a month ago, to return a ring that belonged here, and I have taken nothing from it since, nor wanted to." "How convenient, then," Lord Graves said, stepping forward with a small velvet case already open in his palm, a brooch of sapphires that Marianne had never seen in her life, glittering coldly under the hall's candlelight. "That this was discovered not 10 minutes ago, sewn quite deliberately into the lining of your cloak." 2 footmen arrived at his signal, moving to take her by the arms with the practiced roughness of men following an order rather than their own judgment, and Marianne understood in that instant, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after so much fear, that no amount of honesty was going to save her from a lie built by people with far more power than she would ever have in her whole life. She thought of her father's shaking hands on papers he hadn't understood. She thought, with a bitterness that surprised her, that perhaps this was simply what happened to people like them, over and over, dressed up in different rooms with different faces but always the same outcome. "Let go of her." The Duke's voice cut through the corridor like a struck bell, and every head turned to find him standing in the doorway, still in his dark blue coat, his eyes moving from the footmen's hands on Marianne's arms to the brooch in Graves' palm with an expression that made the footmen release her without waiting to be asked twice, stepping back as though scalded. "That brooch belonged to my late mother," Alaric said, each word measured and cold as the winter air outside. "And it has sat in a locked case in my study since the day she died, a case only 3 people in this household hold keys to, and Lord Graves is not among them. You will explain to me, in front of every witness now gathered in this hallway, precisely how a piece of jewelry from my private study came to be sewn into a woman's cloak at my own ball." Graves' composure cracked exactly enough to be seen by everyone watching. "Your Grace, I merely happened to notice." "You merely arranged it," Alaric said, cutting through the excuse before it could finish forming. "The same way you arranged for my signet ring to be hidden inside a ledger belonging to the Aldridge estate a month ago, hoping some desperate soul would try to sell it and hang for theft, a scandal you could then lay conveniently at my door for keeping such careless company among my own household's records. My own men have spent a fortnight tracing that ledger's provenance, Lord Graves, following the same quiet patience you clearly assumed I no longer possessed. It took them rather less time than you hoped to trace the arrangement back to your solicitor's own hand." The hallway had gone utterly silent, every guest who'd followed the commotion upstairs now frozen in the doorway, watching a duke dismantle a viscount in front of them with nothing but the plain, unhurried truth, no raised voice required. "As for you," Alaric said, turning to Marianne, and his voice gentled so completely that several onlookers would later swear they'd witnessed a different man entirely from the cold, unsmiling Duke London had grown used to. "I have spent a year searching for the woman who pulled me from the Kestwick River and refused to let go until I was breathing again on the bank. I did not know, until a locked box of your father's old estate papers was recovered from the very same archive 2 days ago, that the woman I searched for the length of a whole year was also the rightful heir to a barony taken from her family through debts forged by this very man, in hopes of erasing the Aldridge name from every ledger in England before anyone thought to check his signature against the original deeds." Marianne felt the floor tilt beneath her, not from fear this time, but from the sheer, disorienting weight of hearing her father's name spoken aloud in a crowded hallway as something other than a quiet family shame to be buried and never mentioned. "My father's barony was never legally forfeited," Alaric said gently now, as though he understood exactly how much that single sentence would cost her to hear after so many years of believing otherwise. "It was taken through paper, by a man who understood that a woman's word, even an honest one, even a widow's, has rarely been enough to stand against a man's signature in the eyes of the law, and that a daughter's memory counts for even less in a courtroom. That is precisely the kind of injustice honest records exist to correct, Miss Aldridge, once someone finally troubles to look closely enough and compare a forged hand against a true one." He knelt then, in front of the assembled guests, taking her hands in the way he had taken Cordelia's weeks before in that quiet sitting room, except this time there was nothing performed about it at all, nothing measured for an audience. "I am not asking you to marry a duke," he said quietly, for her ears more than the crowded hallways. "I am asking the woman who saved my life a year ago, and never once asked for anything in return, whether she might allow me to spend the rest of mine trying to deserve what she gave me freely in the dark, under a bridge, for no reason but her own honest heart." Lord Graves was escorted from the house before the sun rose, his forged records seized and matched, letter for letter, against the true deeds finally recovered from the Faro Street archive, the comparison so plain that even his own solicitor could not defend it once pressed. Lady Cordelia left Wembrook House that same night, her ambitions considerably diminished, though her fortune remained entirely her own, a fact Alaric was careful to ensure, for even a woman who had wronged another deserved better than ruin over an alliance she had never actually secured, and he found, once the anger of the evening cooled, that he bore her less ill will than he might have expected. Marianne stood with Alaric on the east terrace as the first grey light broke over London, the silver signet ring finally back where it belonged, resting once more on her own hand instead of a stranger's desk. She thought of her father, and of every year she'd spent believing her family's ruin had been their own fault rather than a theft dressed up in official paper and a stranger's borrowed authority. She thought that perhaps the truest kind of courage was not the loud kind that people wrote songs about, but the quiet, stubborn habit of returning what wasn't yours and telling the truth even when a lie would have been so very much easier to carry day after ordinary day. "What will you tell people?" she asked him, watching her own breath cloud in the cold morning air. "About how we met." "The truth," Alaric said, watching the sun climb over the rooftops of a city that had no idea yet how much had changed within it overnight. "That I owe my life to an honest woman, and that honesty, in the end, turned out to be worth considerably more than a duke's ransom, or a viscount's schemes, or anything else London tried to weigh against it. If the story reminded you that doing the right thing is rarely the easy thing and that it matters anyway, even when no one is watching, I'd love to hear it. Subscribe to see how this unfolds in the next one, and comment below where you're watching from tonight. I always love saying hello and finding out just how far our story has traveled to reach you.